All right, I said I wanted to do one more whiteboard video, kind of introducing us to a SQL query, right? To start here, I have a screenshot of Excel. Now, Excel is not a relational database. I want to make that very clear, but it does allow you to create tables. And tables are something we want to talk about when we talk about relational data. So I'll say this whole thing here is a table, right? Tables consist of rows. So if I circled my numbers down the side here, and actually I'm going to erase that and be a little bit more prudent in my circling, right? The rows of data are really only 2, 3, and 4, right? Row 1 in this Excel table is actually column headers, but we'll talk about that in a minute. So 2, 3, and 4 are rows, right? And then tables have rows and columns. A, B, C, and D represent columns. So maybe super simple. At this point, sometimes I like to talk about synonyms, other terminology that you'll hear. Like sometimes tables will be referred to as entities. So I'll say entity. Hopefully I spelled that correctly. Sometime in the mathematical form of relational algebra, they might even be called relations. This term isn't used very often, but I wanted to make sure that you heard it. Rows are maybe called records, right? You've heard maybe somebody say, oh, that's a record in the database, right? Really what they're meaning, that's a row in a table in the database, right? So vocabulary is important, especially if you're trying to communicate your knowledge of SQL in an interview situation, for example. So I like to focus on it. The mathematical kind of relational algebra term for rows would be tuples, which nobody really uses. So there we have tables and rows, entities, relations, records, tuples can be, there's some synonyms and often the words are used interchangeably. For columns, sometimes those are just referred to as fields in the database, right? But again, fields in the database translates to, oh, it's a column in a table in a database, right? Sometimes they're called attributes. I don't know if that's the mathematical term. I know relations and tuples are kind of the mathematical terms that have fallen out of favor, but all the other ones are that you won't hear very often, not that they've fallen out of favor. But all the other ones are hopefully pretty common, and you can think of them as synonyms. I like to do that exercise. Somebody will say a record in the database. Well, technically, that is a row in a table in a database, right? If I were to draw my cylinder, it would be drawn around this whole thing. And then there might be 50 other tables as well, right? So again, just getting us down to the table level, because it's at the table level that we actually start writing queries, right? So maybe I'll write my first query here on the whiteboard, and I'll say select, and I'll put a star in there or an asterisk from and this looks like a table of possibly customers. Our table, we didn't talk about it having a name yet, but we might call this a table of customers. And it has currently 3 customers. It stores an ID for them. I should be drawing here. It stores an ID and a unique ID for each customer. And really, I see my screenshot has an error there. That should be a 3. I'm not going to remake this video, but hopefully we can kind of see that errors are opportunities to learn. But it contains an ID for each customer that's unique. So we might even call that a primary key. It contains a last name for each customer. In this case, I have 2 customers with the last name Doe, one with the last name Smith. It contains a first name for each customer, John, Jane, and Suzanne, and the state that they reside in, right? So if I start breaking down this select star from customers, our first SQL query, it kind of has, this one has 2 clauses. It has a select clause and a from clause, right? The select clause, naively, we'll think at this point says, well, which columns do I want to see? So remember, columns are ID, L name, F name, and state. So star means all of them, right? I want to get back all of the columns from the customers table, right? So if this entire table was named customers, that's how I reference it in a SQL query. So If I bust this out a little bit, sometimes I'll call this star. I'll say, what are we selecting, right? So which columns do we want to see, or what are we selecting from? And this one I'll say, which table? Or sometimes I'll say where, but that translates to which table. And here I'll say parenthetical S, which tables. Eventually, it's a more advanced thing, but you can select data from more than one table, right? But we have to crawl before we walk, walk before we run, so we'll wait and get into that. This is a very basic query. We'll write this query when we do our code along demo, but I wanted to make it a little bit more advanced here, just to add one additional clause. So I'm going to say select. Here I'm going to say L name, comma, F name. Maybe I'll switch that. I'll rewrite that and say I want to get back just the first name and the L name. So F name and L name. And we'll say from customers. But I want to add another clause, right? I want to add the where clause. And we'll say where state equals open single quote or apostrophe, capital W, capital I, where state equals Wisconsin. And I didn't mention it, but sometimes we end our SQL queries with semicolons. And if I'm coding on a whiteboard, sometimes I'll end it on a whiteboard like that, right? So if I asked you to, what are some clauses of the select statement? You would say, oh, there's a select clause. Oh, there's a from clause. Oh, there's a where clause. This is new in this particular query, right? The select clause, rather than selecting the star, selecting all the columns, just selects out two of them. Oops, I meant for that to be the blue marker, right? First name and last name. So if I scroll up, all it's going to get is these two columns, right? So it's going to ignore ID and ignore the state, right? It's just going to bring me back first names and last names in a different order, right? I'm selecting first name, then last name. So I'm going to get John Doe, Jane Doe, Suzanne Smith, right? I'm not going to get Suzanne Smith, though, because we have a where clause. Well, first of all, I'll reiterate from which table, in this case, a single table called customers. But then we have our third clause, which says what rows do we want, right? So I only want rows where state is equal to Wisconsin. So up in my table here, it's only going to get me these two rows where the state is equal to WI or Wisconsin, right? So this is commonly my mind's eye view of a query. I'll do something even slightly more controversial. I'm going to add some line numbers here. Say this was line 01. We have a blank line 02 of our edited or our query editor. I have a blank line, or I have another line of 03. I'll have a blank line of 04. Because I wanted to put in a bunch more lines here, because the way that so I'm going to say 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. I don't know how many lines I'll actually need, so I'll stop at 11. If I have to add more, I will, right? The way that I like to think of a query is one logical item per line, right? So if I were to write this query that's currently on one line on line 3, if I were to write that for real in the real world, here's how I would do it. And I'll start on line 5. Select. That introduces the clause. Line 5 says it's a new query and it's a select statement, right? Then I'll say, what am I selecting? And I'll even do a little indenting, and I'll say I'm selecting first name. And then this is kind of controversial, but I will put first F name or that column name on a line by itself. Then I'll put a comma out front and I'll say L name on a line by itself, right? So it's no different than what I've written here, because SQL ignores all these extra new lines. It ignores any extra spaces or tabs. This comma in front, you'll see throughout this class, I use that to my advantage at times. When we do the demo, you'll see that, I can easily put a comment there, a dash in front of L name and take that column out, right? But hopefully we can also see that this, oops, and I didn't mean to drop that down, but we can see that this L name and F name are just there, but rather than all in one line, I separate it out. If I finish rewriting my query here, I'll put the from keyword on a line by itself. I'll indent the customer's table name on a line by itself. I'll put where on a line by itself. And it looks like I need to write some new line numbers, right? So I have to do 12, 13, 14. We'll say where state equals, for some reason my whiteboard's pausing here a little bit, but hopefully it will catch up, where state equals single quote WI, close single quote. And then sometimes I'll even put my semicolon on a line by itself. This is my mind's eye view of a query, right? And I typically will write them. This query, I can glance at it and see it has 3 clauses, select from and where, right? What am I selecting? First name and last name. From which tables? Currently just a customers table. Do I have any filter criteria? I haven't used that word yet, but the where clause is which rows. Maybe I should have written that up here. I'll say this is which rows am I selecting, or sometimes this is called a filter. I'm filtering the rows in the table to be just this, right? Anyhow, so clauses, select, this is where I put the select information. From, this is where I put the table information. Where, this is where I put the filter information. We'll come back and we'll actually start writing this query against data just like this in our next video. So thanks for watching and sticking with me so far on the whiteboard. Again, these are great ways to kind of start writing SQL on a whiteboard, maybe in an interview situation. You don't have to get it exactly right, because for crying out loud, it's just on a whiteboard, but it can be an effective way to communicate what we're talking about. So stay tuned. We'll come back and do some of this for real. Thanks.